Of course, the Church appreciates and encourages the progress of the biomedical sciences, which open up unprecedented therapeutic prospects until now unknown, for example through the use of somatic stem cells or treatment that aims to restore fertility or cure genetic diseases. At the same time, she feels duty-bound to enlighten all consciences to the only authentic progress, namely, that scientific progress truly respects every human being, whose personal dignity must be recognised since he is created in the image of God.
Sometimes couples experience a difficulty in starting their family. Sometimes the problem is temporary and is an experience of subfertility. But often couples experience long-standing and unexplained fertility problems. Scripture itself provides us with some very vivid descriptions of the grief that women experience when they're unable to have a child. The Church recognises the distress and desperation that couples can feel and speaks out in a spirit of love and concern for those under her care. Couples experiencing infertility require much love, support and advice.
The most obvious moral concern with IVF is the leftover embryos that are destroyed, frozen, or even experimented upon. So that IVF can be even somewhat effective, women must be given powerful drugs so that they produce many eggs all at once. With these powerful drugs, on average, women produce between 5 and 20 eggs. And many of these eggs are then fertilised outside the human body in a laboratory dish. After several days, 1 or 2 of the embryos which seem to be growing best are selected and transferred to the woman's womb, where it is hoped they will implant and grow. The moral problem is what happens to the other leftover embryos. Each of these embryos began as a single cell. Within that single cell, DNA from their mother combined with DNA from their father to form a new organism whose unique DNA marks it as a unique individual, a new human life. By the time some embryos were selected for transfer to the mother's womb, each of these embryos had grown maybe 150 or so cells. And whether we are talking about an embryo of a single cell or an embryo with 150 cells, we should never forget that each one of us was once an organism of that size. Put simply, any viable embryo should be treated as any other viable embryo. Sadly, the IVF process leaves the majority of viable embryos in either frozen suspension or they're destroyed in experiments. A less obvious but perhaps even more profound concern with IVF involves the separation between sexual intercourse and the conception of the child. When a married couple seek to have a child, they're participants in God's creative activity. The love they share and the child they conceive is a gift from God. By separating sexual intercourse from conception, we diminish the intrinsic value of both their love and their divine intention. When technology is used to achieve conception, we can so easily begin to see the child less as a gift and more as a product, less as someone and more as something, less as a person and more as an object. One of the Vatican congregations which assists the Pope, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, put it this way: in reality, the origin of a human person is the result of an act of giving. The one conceived must be the fruit of his or her parents' love. He or she cannot be desired or conceived as the product of an intervention of biological or medical techniques. That would be the equivalent to reducing him or her to an object of scientific technology. Once we start to think of the child as the product of a manufacturing process, it's easy to think that anything should be permitted in this process. If a couple cannot conceive using their own eggs and sperm, some fertility doctors will suggest that they have a child using sperm from another man or eggs from another woman. If the woman cannot or will not carry the child in her own womb, Some fertility doctors will suggest that another woman might be used as a surrogate mother or a gestational carrier. These changes have caused great harm. In the past, sperm donors and egg donors in Australia were allowed to remain anonymous. We now have a generation of young adults who may not even know that one of the parents who raised them was not their biological father or biological mother. If they do know, many have no way of ever contacting or meeting the man or woman who is their biological father or biological mother. Like children who have been separated from their parents through forced adoption, many of these donor-conceived children tell us that this situation is very distressing to them. Australian laws forbid payment for surrogacy. Overseas, however, commercial surrogacy has become yet another way in which the rich can exploit the poor, as poor women, particularly in India, are paid as surrogates for couples from wealthier countries. Embryos produced in a laboratory can also be pre-screened for genetic diseases and defects. Once we start to think of the child as the product of a manufacturing process, we move quickly towards the possibility of designer babies. There are also other concerns about reproductive technologies like IVF. The pressures and stress of the IVF process have destroyed some relationships. Some women are harmed by the powerful drugs that they must take to produce many eggs all at once. Indeed, the long-term effects of these drugs are still unknown. There also seems to be a higher incidence of congenital diseases and other problems among babies conceived through IVF. And of course, these technologies cannot guarantee a child. Despite the claims of more than half the couples who try IVF, more than one couple in 2 or 50 couples in 100 will pay thousands and thousands of dollars, sometimes for many cycles of IVF, without ever having a child.
From as far back as 1987, the Church outlined her ethical and social concerns about reproductive technology in an important document called Donum Vitae, which means the gift of life. In this document, the Church does not condemn the motives of couples seeking to overcome fertility problems. She recognises that the desire for children is a deep and natural good. For a long time, the Church has encouraged research into the causes of infertility. However, she stresses that some methods used in reproductive technology are ethically problematic and warns couples about their harmful effects. When medical science works to find the source of the couple's infertility problem and seeks to treat it, the Church encourages such interventions. For example, a physician may intervene to clear a blocked fallopian tube, which restores the couple's fertility. In this situation, the couple can then conceive naturally, and the physician is no longer needed. The Church has also been directly involved in encouraging improved fertility awareness, and this has helped many couples to conceive a child naturally. However, the Church has real concerns about fertility treatment which replace or overlook the place of personal lovemaking in the creation of a child. For example, in IVF, the embryo is created in a laboratory dish. Here, the embryo is far removed from her mother's body or from the sexual love of her parents, and she's dislocated from personal relationships. And it's for this reason that the Church considers IVF immoral, not because there's a problem with science or medicine or because it's artificial, but because IVF breaks natural human relationships. It depersonalises the couple's relationship with each other, and it also removes the dignity that is owed to the human embryo. Not at all. This is a very important point. The Church believes that all children, however they are conceived, are precious children of God. Like all children, they're made in God's image and should be loved and cared for, baptised and welcomed by our families and societies and by the Church herself.
Although the manner in which human conception is achieved with IVF and embryo transfer cannot be approved, every child which comes into the world must in any case be accepted as a living gift of the divine goodness and must be brought up with love.
If a couple experience difficulty in having a child, both of them should begin with thorough medical examinations. Sometimes this reveals obstacles that can be remedied. For example, there can be surgery for endometriosis, treatments to unblock fallopian tubes or to repair them surgically, or hormonal treatments for infertility. There are doctors who specialise not in technologies like IVF, but in treatments and therapies which assist women to conceive. Your parish priest can assist you by asking about in the church community to direct you to doctors and Catholic hospitals who specialise in these treatments and therapies. God is close to anyone who experiences any kind of difficulty. The Church also strives to be close to couples who are struggling to conceive and to support them with pastoral concern and prayer. Sadly, even after good medical help and despite the claims of fertility clinics, some couples will never have a child. There is a real grieving that couples undergo as they gradually let go of this cherished dream of having their own child. The Church strives to be with couples in this time of grief and to support them at this difficult time. After one dream dies, it often happens that another can take its place. Some couples are able to adopt a child. Others are able to be foster parents. Still others are able to be involved in many different ways in the lives of many children, or to serve the human family in other ways through their work or through other commitments. Couples who are unable to have a child tell us that this is a great cross, but it is not the end of the world.
Aside from the loss of human life and the attack on human dignity, the Church has very real concerns about the care the couple, and particularly the woman, receives during the process as well as after the process. And she recognises that a particular set of circumstances face children born of IVF. Many couples are so focused on having a child through IVF, they don't consider the possibility that the treatment will not be successful. In fact, very often it's not. They may not have realised that the treatment involves some very burdensome treatment. Both physically and emotionally, this is stressful. They also may not have discussed what to do with the remaining embryos that are created through IVF, and they'll face many difficult ethical decisions about the ongoing storage and the destruction of the embryos. Before starting on IVF, the couple may not have realised the sense of loss and responsibility that will face them during and after the treatment. The technology used in IVF has given rise to other possibilities, such as genetic screening and the selection of different characteristics in the embryo. And this opens up a minefield of ethical dilemmas and questions, which pose challenges not only to the couple, but to doctors, scientists, and the whole of society. The child cannot help but, in some cases, being viewed as a commodity, and the unconditional nature of parental love is tested to its limits. As a society, we should be wary of only listening to those positive stories, those headlines that appear in the media about IVF. We should be willing to listen to the voices of those who have not been positively treated by this experience. Now, the Catholic Church is not alone in its concerns about IVF. Feminist commentators and others speak out against IVF. As we've already mentioned, the children born of IVF procedures have begun to speak up for themselves. They've begun to complain about the practices which created them in the first place. There are lobby organisations such as Tangled Webs, which are springing up to support those who suffer the separation caused by IVF. Women and couples who've been directly involved in IVF speak of the burden to their health, both physical and psychological, as well as the damage such experience has brought to their own relationships. It's well known that couples on IVF often separate after the stress and strain of the procedure. A number of feminists speak out against IVF because they fear that the whole process exploits women and that the medical profession itself is using them to gain funding or the experience of research which is not necessarily intended to help their own infertile situation. These feminists fear that procedures can, at the heart, desire to control women and their bodies and violate their bodies in ways which are dangerous, destructive and debilitating. One commentator, Anne Poppard, writes that the promises of reproductive technology are false, and worse than that, they are cruel, because they're offered to women at a time in their lives when they experience infertility, when they feel the most vulnerable to exploitation. It plays on their worth as women. Many groups who promote the equality of people who are sick and disabled also speak about the dangers of discrimination against disability or gender, because IVF uses selection of desirable characteristics and pressures parents to choose children that do not have disability or have the desired sex. And this commodifies the child, who's then created with a specification of desired qualities. These groups believe that such processes undermine the value of every child and of every disabled individual. It also pressures the unconditional acceptance and love of children, whatever their ability or disability. In our society, people often feel like failures if they don't have their own children. And that can be for single people or for those who are infertile and married. And it's very important to realise that sometimes careless comments or the pressure to go on IVF makes their situation worse. However, a few months ago, Pope Benedict spoke beautifully about the dignity and true marriage of people who are infertile. He also spoke of their opportunity to provide love and care to other children and to bring them into their lives and families. I think this is a very important vocation for those who find that despite all their best efforts and despite all the good technology that is used to assist them properly, they are not able to have children. They are not failures. Their vocation to bring love and joy to children around the world is indeed very great.
Sadly, even with good medical help, some couples will not be blessed with children of their own. The Church acknowledges the suffering that this can cause, but also affirms such couples and calls them on in their married vocation, inviting them to consider other important services to the life of the human person, such as adoption, various forms of educational work, and assistance to other families and to poor or disabled children.
Fidelity to God's design for life and love undoubtedly places a heavy burden on some Catholic couples who are unable to have a child. No one should take their suffering lightly. They are close to the heart of God and God's Church, and their vocation to marriage and family remains a great gift to the Church and society. Indeed, in an age where scientific solutions are often sought at the expense of human values, the decision not to use ethically problematic reproductive technologies like IVF makes these couples authentically pro-marriage, pro-child, and pro-life.